Okay, we move quickly on now to Stephen Glaister, and if you'll read Stephen's biography on the back of your green sheet, you will find that there are few people more capable of talking about the issues to do with financing of the roads, highways programme and maintenance programme, and I'm glad that he's here with us. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Chairman. It's really encouraging, isn't it, to hear Isabel talking about London government, a really properly constituted government, getting to grips with the issues and having a proper debate about it. I want to talk about the national situation, where I believe that is not happening at the moment. As I speak, there are at least 5 policy reviews knocking around in Whitehall and Westminster. It's an absolutely unique opportunity historically. This hasn't been the case for a very, very long time, if ever, that we have an opportunity to make our arguments heard and to influence the outcomes. What I'd like to do, first of all, is to set out my stall in terms of the evidence. I prefer to argue these things on the basis of what evidence we have available to us. So I will go quickly through some components of the argument. I won't spend much time on it because it'll be familiar to you, but I just want to log all the bits and pieces that we can bring to bear on the debate. And by the way, I think the government are in some difficulty on their policy on infrastructure at the moment, which increases our opportunity to try and get things changed. The first point I'd like to make, and it's a simple one, but you have to keep making it, is that road users pay for their roads handsomely. The total revenue from road taxation, depending on how you count it, something like 33 billion a year. Total spending of the order of 10 billion a year. Contribution to the Exchequer, therefore, something over 23 billion. Unlike the railways, now the railways get much more attention in national politics than roads do, as we know, and was illustrated by yesterday's events and today's newspapers, full of stuff about railways. Has that ever happened on roads, national or local roads? Absolutely not. But, of course, railways only carry, at best, it's actually 8% of the passenger miles and the same sort of proportion as freight. And they take from the Exchequer 4 billion a year, compared with the roads that pay in 23 billion. But we do have a lot to learn from the railways. I do think governments, plural, over the last decade or so, have put in place a system which is not at all bad for the railways. And I look at that with some envy from the point of view of the roads. They do have the 5-year forward view, in which there is a government high-level output specification, government saying what it wants, and a government statement of funds available, government saying how much it's willing to pay to achieve that, audited and approved, hopefully by an independent regulator, including, in the latest incarnation, 10 billion of extra investment in the railway, in addition to 23 billion or so that is being proposed for high-speed rail. Now, like it or not, we know where we stand with the railway, in a way that we absolutely don't as a nation on the roads. And Alan Cook's report, excellent report, made a recommendation that we should try and construct a similar system, at least a similar system, for the road network. And I approve that, and I'll come back to it. So the government, beg your pardon, the public are paying all this money. What do they want in return? Not what do they get, but what they actually want. Well, Steve Gooding made this point, but I don't think he made it as strongly as I would. If you talk to politicians on the doorstep and you ask them about their conversations on transport policy, typically the politicians will say, the only thing I could get them to talk about was the state of the highway outside their door. The general public hate potholes. And there's evidence for that, and Steve Gooding mentioned some, and I'll mention some more. I'm sure you're familiar with this one. This is the Audit Commission asking people in local affairs what are the things they care about. Number 2 on the list, if you can read it, is road and pavement repairs. Out of all the things in local policy, above facilities for young children, affordable housing, public transport, it's the road maintenance which matters. This was confirmed by some work we at the Foundation had done before the last election. What do you think an incoming government should give most attention to within the transport area? Number one, by a long way, the condition of roads and pavements. Building a high-speed railway somewhere, where is that? Planning and building a high-speed line 3. Railways generally way down the list. That's because people don't use them. They use the roads. They don't really use the railways on the whole. So there's a terrible gap between what people pay for and what they want and what the politicians seem to think is important in the national debate. What would be the benefits in terms of traditionally measured contribution to the economy of better roads? And Donald mentioned this morning. To its eternal credit, Transport Scotland have done the work. And these are the two reports he referred to, one on national Scottish roads and one on local Scottish roads. There are estimates now of the costs and benefits of improving road maintenance spend in Scotland. As far as I'm aware, there's nothing in England. The London DFT hasn't done the work. It was a recommendation of the Potholes Review, which I put up here, that the Department for Transport should do that work. As far as I'm aware, they haven't done very much on that. I don't think you saw in the previous talk, in that list of activity and criteria, a calculation of value for money as seen by users of better roads maintenance. The Foundation, together with Adept, have just commissioned some research to try and replicate for England what Transport Scotland did for Scotland. So we'll have more evidence about the benefits to the economy, that is to people, to industry and so on, about better roads maintenance, or conversely, the disbenefits of poor road maintenance. That will be, I hope, a useful part of the evidence base. We need, as a nation, to understand the asset condition better. You will know this better than I. It's quite hard to get an independent, holistic view of the state of the road network. This document is one we're about to publish, which is a review of the evidence both on condition and on spending trends. It replicates this diagram from the DFT, showing that there are a significant number of local roads which are either in poor condition or not very good condition, and that has not been improving for a long time. We rely enormously on that survey carried out by the Aggregate Industries Alliance, which actually I think is very good, but it really isn't good enough that government is relying on something generated by an industry with a obvious special interest. We need to get to grips with understanding the state of the assets and how much it's going to cost to put them right. But I think what we'd all agree, and we'd have to argue to government, is there's a serious backlog to put the highways into good condition, particularly on local roads. So there we are. People want well-maintained roads. People pay over the odds for their roads. Local roads are in poor condition, and there may or may not be an emerging problem with national roads, strategic roads. And according to the Scottish research, and I think this will be replicated for England, we'll see, it makes very good engineering and economic sense to put them in good condition. You know the thing, a pound saved today means you've got to spend £3 tomorrow just to keep the top on the road. Against that background, what did the 2010 spending review do? You heard it from Steve Gooding. Transport was a priority. And it's true that transport suffered less than many other sectors in the spending review. But when you look under the surface, you of course find, as you all know, there's quite a big increase in rail spending and a severe cut in both national and local roads spending. This is the picture for the Highways Agency, revenue and capital, with a severe reduction. This is the story for local government. Now, of course, this is the whole of local government, showing a 28% real fall over this period for their total spending. When you unpick that, which is what this chart seeks to do. This is one produced by the Local Government Association earlier this year. You see this prediction of income to local authorities and this prediction of their liabilities and a widening gap. And as we've seen in public debate, the realization that local authorities cannot cut everything at the same rate. They have to keep some things going because of their statutory duties and political pressures. And unfortunately, roads maintenance is one of the things that will get squeezed more than the average because of, well, whatever reason, because of the politics of it and the simple responsibilities local authorities have. The implications of this picture over this period are very, very seriously grim for roads maintenance already. It's hard to see on these plans how any money at all can stay in local authority programmes for roads maintenance. That's just what the arithmetic says. And therefore, you can't really believe that this will be the outcome. However, it may be that there is additional pain on the way. I only had this document pointed out to me in preparation for today about a week ago. This is a document, technical consultation from DCLG about the local government finance reform, the business rates reform, which is coming through. Very important and large revision of the way that local governments are going to be funded. It's worth a read, actually, but because it's such a dreadfully difficult, awful document. Putting aside the bad layout and the misprints, it is completely obscure. As a I'm not a lay person, but I'm not an expert in local government finance. I tried and completely failed to understand what it was really saying. And I suspect there are very few people that do understand it. But it does look on the surface as though it implies, this is coming from DCLG, not the Department for Transport, it implies plans for further cuts in local authority roads maintenance. And I say that because there's a table in there, which I'm afraid you won't be able to read, but you can look it up later. It's actually in the context of lots of other stuff, and this line on highway maintenance is not mentioned explicitly in the text at all, I don't think. These numbers to umpteen decimal places, which tells you something, are the parameters that will go into the funding formulae for a central government grant. And the particular ones for highways maintenance here show a 29% reduction over that period. Now, I'm not clear whether that's additional to or in replacement for what we already knew. It may be an element of both. But we certainly need to understand, I have had it said to me by somebody who knows better about these things, that it is in fact an additional cut. I can't confirm that, but I'd like to know. But all I would suggest is, please ask the people in your organisations who understand local government finance to have a good look at this document and work through the implications for roads maintenance. Now, future policy developments, that's a sort of list of considerations. What's going on as we speak? Steve Gooding mentioned the growth agenda. Very important. Almost every discussion around Whitehall at the moment is what can you do to contribute to the growth agenda? This was reflected in the Prime Minister's speech on the 19th of March, which I quoted a few phrases from. A very, very important speech from our point of view. First of all, here's a Prime Minister saying, we need more roads. A Prime Minister recognising that as part of the growth agenda, we need more road capacity. That hasn't been said, I don't think, by a Prime Minister or a Chancellor for a very long time. Options for getting large-scale private investment in the National Roads Network. Sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and so on. Great, no problem. And he talked in his speech about the analogy with the water industry, as, again, Steve Gooding mentioned earlier on. Unfortunately, for roads, that model is incomplete. It just does not stack up as currently considered. The Prime Minister wants innovative approaches to the funding of our national roads. Funding, notice that word, to increase investment and reduce congestion. Road tolling is one option, but, and this is the crucial thing, we're only considering this for new, not existing capacity. So he is forswearing the ability to raise charges on existing capacity to pay for new infrastructure. That's why the analogy with water does not go through, because now you pay for your water by units used. A lot of domestic users do, all industrial users do. It has funded a vast investment over the years in the water industry without a penny of taxpayers' exchequer money. But we don't have that facility in roads. So against that background, the government have now started these 5 reviews, and maybe 1 or 2 more I haven't thought of, which are relevant. Treasury is doing a review of vehicle excise duty. Interesting that, isn't it? The Treasury are reviewing one of the major charges for the Department for Transport's business, and that's, of course, true of fuel duty and almost every other sector in the economy. They're reviewing private finance initiative. They have the feasibility review of road funding and ownership models. They are, hooray, developing a national roads strategy. And they're developing a transport strategy for publication, I think, next spring. The overall theme of all of this is, yes, we want growth. We must have growth. The subtext is, but there's no new money. And that's where a lot of the problems come from, I believe. In my view, the PFI has had all sorts of problems, but for our field, local roads maintenance and shadow-tolled roads, it's actually rather a good candidate, and it's worked rather well. And the next speaker will have something, I believe, to say about the experience in Manchester. Sorry, I beg your pardon, in Birmingham. I think it's fallen into disrepute because of sloppy thinking about the distinction, and people may have heard me say this before, have to keep on saying it. It's simple stuff, but terribly confused. The distinction I would make between financing and funding. PFI is about borrowing money, it's financing. Of course, you have to pay it back. And the confusion amongst the public, which has been fostered by politicians, is that PFI, for hospitals or roads or whatever, is the private sector stepping in to provide infrastructure that the taxpayer cannot afford. That's a quote from Tony Blair. Private sector stepping in to provide infrastructure the taxpayer cannot afford. And of course that's nonsense. What has come to light is, surprise, surprise, these PFI deals do have to be paid for over the 30-year term of the contract. And the general public is now being faced with the bills and suddenly realizes that PFI wasn't what it was described to be. Which is not to say PFI has no use. It does have uses, but you have to understand this basic point. It is financing, not funding, and the pigeons will come home to roost under a PFI scheme. So I hope the government will reinvent the PFI in some form because they need it and it's useful. But they will also have to recognise that if they're going to have more PFI schemes, to have more local roads maintenance or national road investment and maintenance, it will require more money from the exchequer. You can't get away from that. And you have to see this in the national context on infrastructure, which is really frightening. The Infrastructure UK review of all of this comes to a view, and others have come to a similar view, that over the next 10 years or so, the nation needs of the order of £500 billion worth of new infrastructure. This is pipes and wires and roads, hospitals, all the rest of it. In other words, let's say 40 to 50 billion a year of new investment. And as I say on the slide, it's a funding requirement. Somebody's got to pay for it. PFI will not deliver this. Well, they may deliver it, but they won't provide the basic funding. The financing is just a way of adjusting the timing. Fundamentally, we've got to make a decision as a nation whether we're going to build this infrastructure, and if so, who's going to pay for it. And by the way, a point that is so often neglected, the reason for this requirement is only partly to do with historic underinvestment. It is partly that, but only partly. It's also very largely to do with a growing population. In some parts of the country, the population will grow at 20% every decade. London, I think it's 16 and 17% over a period of to 2031 or something like that. More people, you need more stuff. Somebody's got to pay for it. And that's the thing which ministers, I don't think, are really facing up to. Pension funds will only invest for a return. In other words, the finance they won't fund. We have to say where the money is going to come from. And to meet the Prime Minister's aspiration, I think we have to change the way we look at our roads. We have to provide something the private sector can invest in. There has to be an investable proposition, which isn't at the moment. And that means a dedicated income stream, a bankable income stream to repay the pension funds or whatever, and a legal structure so you know who to sue, basically. Who's accountable for repaying the debt? Interesting, in London you have that now. London issues debt on the markets, and all of that is there. But outside London, it's absolutely not there. And so until that's changed, the Prime Minister will not get his investment from the Chinese or from my pension fund, I hope. The recent announcement of the A14 is very welcome. This, I think, was a U-turn and maybe a thin end of a wedge, a good wedge, because it's recognising that to get the A14 done, and we really, really need to get that scheme built, we are willing to talk about tolls on an existing line of route after improvement. But, unfortunately, there are, in the UK, densities are so high, in England particularly, densities are so high, there are very few opportunities of hoping to get a completely privately funded road through tolls alone. Even on the A14, it will be a combination of perhaps 1/3 tolls, 1/3 exchequer grant, and 1/3 local authority grant. And thereby hangs a tail, of course, the business of getting that money together from a large number of different competent authorities who've already spent the money many times over on other things. Will, I believe, unfortunately, be the thing that stops this A14 proceeding on the basis the government wants it to proceed. We'll see about that. But the fundamental point is that tolls on existing roads will not do the trick, because the need is for more strategic road capacity and more maintenance across the whole network. And therefore, if you are going to get the money in this way, you have to start thinking about charging user charges across a much wider network than on the individual road. So the bottom line here, literally the bottom line here, is that we need to understand, all of us, that if the government is unwilling to change the charging regime in a significant way, then one of two things will happen. The roads will get a lot worse, congestion will go up, condition will go down, or taxpayers will have to pay more. I don't think there's any other way out of it. It's either the exchequer or local tax sources will have to be increased to do that. So, first of all, what is it reasonable to expect over the next few months as a result of these policy reviews? Actually, reasonable to insist on, in my view. First of all, implementation of Alan Cook's recommendation that at the very least, for the strategic road network, there's something like a high-level output specification, a statement of funds available, as in the railways. It's perfectly reasonable to expect that, given the life of the asset. And I would hope it would be more than 5 years, but 5 years would be better than nothing. That money for the railways is legally ring-fenced. That's why the railways survived so well in the spending review. Once the HLOS and the SOFA are committed, they're legally protected. We need to do that for the roads in some way too, and stop the annual messing about with the Highways Agency budget so they can run the business properly. So that then leads you to, I hope, an outcome which separates the Highways Agency somewhat at least from the bowels of Marsham Street as a separate organisation with competence in the legal sense to manage a business. Secondly, we absolutely must have a proper national road strategy and a proper central government strategy for local roads, because, of course, the two things go together. It's just crazy we haven't had one. It's just absurd. The government are talking about putting one together, and let's hope it makes sense. But this needs a horizon of 20, 30, 40 years, because that's the horizon of population growth and the horizon of the asset lives. But it's reasonable to insist that we get that over the next 2-3 months. I think it's reasonable to insist that there is a centrally held understanding of the assets. Now, I imagine the information for this is easily available now. The asset base, the condition, quantity of local and national assets. Once you have that, of course, you can begin to talk about how much money you need to maintain them and improve them. Without that, you don't know that information, and you can't begin to proceed. And it's just good management to have all of that centrally held, so you've got the big picture. And then we don't need to rely on the Asphalt Industries Alliance surveys. So that's what we must expect. Further, what might we hope for reasonably? Well, this last couple of slides is a list going from the reasonable to the nice to have to the hopelessly impossible, I suspect. For the reasons I've given, I think we might hope for an increase in new ring-fence money for local highway maintenance and national highway maintenance. It's electorally popular, you might think, because that's what people say they want. And it is, of course, an excellent high value for money way of spending money quickly in the name of regenerating the economy. And that's what the government say they want to do. So you really should be knocking on the door, and I know many people in the room are, to the Treasury to be saying, this is a spectacularly good way of spending the money you seem to want to spend. I think we should certainly hope for and perhaps expect a reinvention of the private finance initiative. The government, as I said earlier, it's had its faults, but once people understand how it actually works, it has a lot to offer, both local authorities and the Highways Agency. And we'll hear more about that in a moment. So certainly, let's see a new but realistic view about the role of PFI in all of this. Brackets to re-emphasize, you have to be willing to spend more money to get the private sector to sign up to a PFI deal. Now, we're moving into the area of speculation. There are interesting ideas around, and I know they're being seriously considered in Whitehall and Westminster, to reform vehicle excise duty. I think it's around $6 billion a year on the earlier slide, and start using that as a stream of income to remunerate the private sector. And as a user, you might perhaps get credits when you buy your tax disc, and you use those credits if and only if you use designated roads, busy roads, big roads, whatever. And if you don't use the credits, they're available to you next year against your next year's tax disc. That's a simple way of introducing a kind of quasi-road user charging without frightening horses too much. Maybe we'll see an adoption of a scheme of that kind, and that might be the beginning of a really interesting and worthwhile reform of our roads. Once you start to do that, you then need an asset base. You need an asset base anyway, but an asset base which is regulated. Now that means not only do you know what's in it physically, how much it's going to cost to maintain, but what its value is and how that value is enhanced in the public interest. The regulation comes from an independent judgment about what it's worth doing to put into the asset base in the public interest. You see there, you're moving towards representing the interests of people as users, as customers, rather than engineers who want to do work on the road network. And you're moving towards a system we now have in all our other utilities. And by the way, the roads, of course, are far and away the most important and the biggest of the utilities. You could move, and I know the government are considering this, but how far they'll go, I don't know. You could move to an independent, regulated utility. Not necessarily privatized, but owned by a public interest company or trust. We know how to do this. There are trust airports, trust ports. The Americans have got called public benefit corporations, I believe. The point is, that's a legal structure people can invest in, well formed, accountable to the law, but you don't have a privatization, which upsets a lot of people. On the other side of the same coin, you don't therefore get a lot of cash for the Treasury. Finally, at the bottom of the list, and who knows, in Mrs. Thatcher's days, if we had Nick Ridley doing this, he'd probably go straight for the bottom option, just create a watertight privatised utility, funded out of charges to users. You would then need, of course, to offset those charges by reductions in fuel duty and VED, and we've worked through the kind of options that are available to you there, and they're really very attractive. You get fuel much cheaper in country areas, improve social inclusion, all sorts of the good things you could do with that. But I wonder whether the government will be brave enough to go that far. But those are the kind of options which are on the table, at least, as we speak. And I hope everybody in the room will take an interest in pushing government towards a better outcome than we have at the moment. And I think at the end of the day, this is the point. We want to serve the public interest. It's not about serving the industry. Of course it isn't. We want to represent what people want and to give them something back for the money that they are spending. Thank you.